Hey, welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. This is Andy Littleton, and I am here with my buddy Sean in Portland, Oregon, sitting on the side of the road next to, what's this coffee shop called?
Upper Left
Coffee Roasters.
Yep.
Yeah, and then some cars going by and stuff like that, but you all are used to hearing noise. There's no country music at EXO, unless Eric dubs some of that in back in Tucson. But we're here in Portland, and we were just having coffee inside, and we are both interested in church planting. And Sean does a lot of work with social entrepreneurship, teaches. Where do you teach?
Warner Pacific University.
At Warner Pacific University. So you got to tell me about this. You're getting some people together today. What are you guys going to talk about today?
Yeah, so today's topic is there's cycling guy going by. Local church ministry and startups. Okay. So initially it was going to be church planting and startups, but I wanted to be more, not just church planting guys, but just like local church leaders, pastors, etc. So not just planters. So this afternoon we're getting together and just have a conversation to see who's interested and what does it mean to think about startups in the context of church planting. How does it benefit churches to be involved in starting businesses, whether it's for their own financial stability or bettering their neighborhood.
Yeah. So we were just talking about, we've had this discussion a lot because I've got a little company called Midtown Artisans that I started back kind of simultaneously to starting the church. You've written books. You've started a coffee roastery. You had a publishing company for a bit. So this is something you've experienced. There's our Portland compost one more time. In Tucson we have a train. Here we have compost. That's pretty safe. But so you've kind of done this. You planted a church in Tucson in the past.
Yep.
And so you've got some experience. But we were just talking about like a sustainable pastor. That's kind of where we left off inside.
Yeah.
Was like I had this journey basically where whether the church grew or not, I was able to make my home in Tucson.
Yeah.
And how important is that? Just from what you've experienced over the years, like in your own life and what you've seen in other pastors.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line is if the pastor is not sustainable, then the church will never be sustainable. And again, the way funding mechanisms work for most planters is, they get a lot on the front end, and a lot could mean just, a few $1,000s a month. So some guys roll into town with almost $1 million, kind of donated to them, and so they have some good funding and ongoing.
Which is wild to me. That whole,
I know.
Wow. What's that like?
Those guys, I joke with them. I call them the 1%ers.
The 1%
of church planting. But even with all of that, that doesn't mean it's success.
Right.
Meaning that doesn't guarantee success, especially in a context like Portland, that's more expensive, higher cost of living. So you kind of end up burning through the money a lot faster. And if at the end you got even 50 to 70 people, that's still not going to sustain the lead guy long term. And so for me, I always dial back to okay, so how do we ensure the planter or pastor is sustainable? Because like you said, and with the example of your stories, like you were sustainable yourself from day one.
Right.
So regardless of how fast or slow the church grew, you were good. You're in it for the long term. Whereas a lot of guys, especially if they're moving in from the outside, once funding runs out, then they're really in that dilemma. Are they really committed to then just kind of get a job and hustle it and just keep it going? Or does that mean they go back home, or do they step out of ministry to get a job.
Take some other job and just kind of move on from that.
Yeah. So,
which I've seen all that.
Yeah. And so again, I guess one of the things that I'm interested on the Intrepid front, what I'm leading is like, how do we really push this conversation forward where like, let's get guys sustainable themselves from the beginning.
Yeah.
Because then again, if they're sustainable, then their church will be sustainable, and that's why we're also looking to, help them curate, business startups. So that's why we're jumping into, training, facilitating conversations around social entrepreneurship, as well as community and economic development.
So Intrepid, you just mentioned, that's kind of an initiative that you started to foster this type of thing.
Exactly.
Essentially.
Yeah. Yep.
And you're writing about, so you're writing, you're gathering people, you're teaching at the college. So you got a book coming out that I've read that
and endorsed
wholeheartedly, and you're kind of casting this vision out there, and you're referring to an old kind of story, coming from the Tucson area, Father Kino, and how he brought some of his life experience to bear alongside ministry, and how those two really worked well together. But what's in the book, like, what did you, in that writing process, what did you conclude after kind of working through that process or so?
I would say there are multiple themes. So again, starting off looking at the story of Father Kino, and like you mentioned, if you're around Southern Arizona or even Sonora, Mexico for any amount of time, you know that name well. Whether you know much about him, but but it's crazy. It's like, wow, 300 years later, like we still know this Jesuit missionary / priest. Like then it's like, okay, so why do we know about him? And obviously he established a number of missions, but I think even more so was what endears us to him is that he, brought, farming techniques, and really I put in the language that he was all about economic development. Yeah. Like he started with a couple head of cattle, and then by the time he died, he had 50,000 head of cattle, all for, the Pimas to help them, grow a stronger economic base. And so, to me, looking at that template, like we know him because of all the good that he brought. So if all he did was, and again, that goes back to even church planting. Like, what's the end goal for a lot of church planters is I want to grow a large church or multiply, which is great. And I'm not saying we should do things so people will remember us 300 years from now, but...
You're just asking, why did we remember this guy? Right?
Yeah, because of all the good that he brought. And so I think there has to be... It's not to minimize one and elevate the other. So along with planting, we can also be about bringing good to our communities. And then that other conversation along with that is, why don't we think along those lines? It's imperative for planters to think, going back to what we were talking about earlier, is just having a stronger financial base themselves to carry them. So there's those kind of themes really poked and prod throughout the book, as well as kind of looking at where are we planting churches. And again, we're here in the heart of Portland, which is a hotbed for planting.
You were saying kind of like all the cool planters want to come to Portland, Seattle.
Or similar kinds of places. If it's in Chicago, it's in the Loop.
Yeah.
But no one as a whole, willingly goes to like crappy neighborhoods, crappy cities, low-income communities to plant. And so that's another theme in Intrepid, is like, how do we champion those kinds of communities, lower income, even minority communities, not with some colonial framework, like we're going to come and make it better or great or anything like that, but just how do we be part of the storyline of these communities and live out the gospel.
Yeah, I remember distinctly a discussion that I had. This is before church planting was ever on my radar and really shaped me, but it was a church where I went was planting. And the reason they were planting, truth be told, if we really get down to the bottom of it, the reason they were planting is because people had different visions within the church and just couldn't synchronize. So one group decided to plant, and they all felt better about a plant than a split. But they brought in some guy, and he was talking about all the growing churches and like the neighborhoods where people had enough money to sustain a church, and they were pointing out like all the areas in Tucson where there was opportunity, and that opportunity had to do with usually like the amount of money that people had, like side by side with the lack of saturation of churches in the area. And if you had the right, combo, then church would work. And so they identified a certain area of like northwest suburban Tucson where that was, and all sorts of churches have popped up over there. And I remember just as a kid, because I'd grown up in a trailer park in central Tucson, and I was just like, man, this sucks because like where I grew up, we'll never get a church if this is how we think. And so we kind of had the discussion with our elders where we said, where do people not want to have a church? And let's try. So we just moved a minute south, but we seriously moved into an area where it's extremely mixed income. We're next to 2 Section 8 apartment homes. It's half industrial. And we were like, one of our favorite things. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
We're getting photographed, which is cool. We are.
Right,
Yeah.
awesome. So I'm going to use this.
Thanks. So one of our favorite things is like we couldn't think of anyone targeting this area, and when we looked on a map, there weren't churches, and there was no economic reason to to start one. So we were like, okay, like cool. This isn't in and of itself like a recipe for church success, which means we can come here and just do it for the sake of like the community. I don't know.
Well, and again, that ties to why it's important to have these other parallel conversations about startups, community development, because if a plant is going into a low-income community, like the thought of like, okay, we need a lot of you to now pay us to reach you. You know what I mean? I mean, that's kind of absurd. I mean, and I look at it like, when it comes to international missions, we don't do that. We'll send missionaries to like the slums of Lima, Peru, or Mexico City, with never the thought of like, okay, we're going to start churches so you guys can pay us to do it. We'd be like, whoa, that's pretty
ridiculous.
That's sketchy too. So why don't we think that way here to go? We're going to focus specifically on lower income communities to plant churches. But in order to do so, we need to think about what's our economic base long term. So again, it goes back to, so if the planter is sustainable long term, even if there's 200 people that gather, but they're low income, whatever, like it doesn't matter. Like if they can't, you know what I mean? It's not about getting X amount of people then to pay bills.
Right. And so the answer to that, usually with international missions and even here, has been, well, the denomination or the church, gives a bunch of money and sends this person. But I think that can lead, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think that can lead to the colonialism sort of thing, because you come in with all these funds and resources into a potentially like community that doesn't have that kind of income stream. So now you're this income stream. You've got something nobody else has, which kind of puts you in a different playing field. And then the flip side of that you've been talking about throughout the morning is like, then that funding runs out and you've got to decide, okay, are you really committed to this? But then with what's just what's happened in America, which has been inevitable for some time, that churches aren't like that. We're post-Christian. I mean, essentially, like this, it's not the dominant cultural theme, and that's just gonna keep happening. So, just to be honest, like those funding streams I'm assuming the next 50 years are going to dry up. And so, do we stop planting churches? And so if you're going to keep planting churches and go to the places where people need to be served and where the gospel isn't available, you're not going to be able to do it on the funding stream, so you're going to have to do it another way. So it seems like we need to start training people to do that now rather than when there are no other options.
And as I've been, doing a lot of thinking about this and just wrestling, I also had decided, I'm just going to, what does the Bible say, about this? Or, what examples do we have? So, just as rereading, the New Testament, obviously particularly Acts and the epistles, and just highlighting in a different color every time Paul would talk about money and giving. And I was just, I guess I knew it, but I was shocked as to how often he would say stuff like, hey, I have it in my right to ask you guys to support me, but just so you know, there's no bad motives. I'm working. I'm not going to be a burden to you. Or there'd be a number of times where he would collect tithes and offerings, but it would be okay, I'm going to swing by, collect money, because the church over there,
I'm going to take it to somebody else.
They're experiencing extreme poverty, so I'm going to collect the money to send it to give to them. And so, a lot of the giving wasn't supporting the paid dude. It was supporting other churches experiencing, maybe acute poverty. And I'm that really is reframing how I think about it.
And don't you think the narrative that presents to our neighbors would just be so much different than the narrative of we need money to run this place?
Yeah.
I every once in a while, so, speaking of the social entrepreneurship, so I've got a client at the business who restaurateur, and we sat down and he was like, so is this all you do? And I said, oh no, I'm also a pastor, because I'm talking to him in the business context. And he goes, oh, he said, you're still doing that, because he'd heard about it once. I said, yeah. He goes, so how does that work? And he was just super intrigued by kind of how what do you do? And so we were talking about it, and then he finally got to, he goes, so where do you how does that make money? And I said, well, honestly, I said, it isn't for us about making money. It's it's using money. There are resources we use, and we want to do a good job with that. But it's not a money making venture. And he's like, okay. He's like, so, but there is money involved. And I was like, yeah. He said, how? And I said, well, the people they see that we're serving, and we're also caring for the spiritual needs, and they give it. And he's like, so how do you get them to give it? And I said, well, they just do. We don't ask. We never ask for money, but we have a little box in the back, and they just know we need money to do what we do, so they give it. And he was just like, this is really fascinating. But conversations like that make me realize that people are just in general in the culture wondering about that. Because then he brought up, he says, have you heard of Joel Osteen?
You're like, no. Who?
Yeah. And I said, yeah, I've heard of it. And he said, isn't that just a little bothersome? I said, yeah, actually. And he said, okay, so you're not doing any of that. No. And then he kind of, okay, well, back to our conversation. But it made me come back to part of our gospel witness, if you will, is what do churches do with their money? Is this a money-making venture where people are building careers? And that, I think, leaves a bad taste in people's mouth.
Yeah. Well,
and that's not to negate the fact that it's right for the worker to get his pay, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I'm not anti any of that. I'm not anti-paid staff or any of that. I just think if we really want to see a lot of churches planted, we just need to rethink it. And again, it's almost like I always wonder, so why is it that when we get in a pressurized tube and we fly 30,000 feet over a body of salt water, and as soon as we exit said pressurized tube, all the rules change.
Right.
I has a good friend, he, was a missionary in South Asia for a few years, And his job was to catalyze new churches. And again, all the planters that they worked with, like, none of them got paid to do it.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
they're just like, they're teachers, they're whatever.
Yeah.
But that's what they do, church planting as a lifestyle. But then all of a sudden we come back here, then when we talk about church planting, it's like, no one wants to do that. They want to
Yeah.
get paid to do that. So why is it, in a lot of settings internationally, that's a norm. But here, it's like, we've so married it with, like, it's my career trajectory, it's my occupation, it's how I earn a living. Again, nothing wrong if, you know, your paid staff or churches even kick in part of it, but I'm just saying if we go in with that's the focus, I think we
Right.
make a lot of compromises. Like, if the end of the day is like, I need to grow this church so they can pay me and take care of my family,
Right.
I think we do like, well, I don't really care. You know what I mean? Like, just
Yeah, it messes with your motivations big
Yeah.
time. Yeah, it was, I mean, a cool experience that I got to have in our process was that the elders of my church got to argue for me to get paid. To where I was saying, like, it's okay if we don't, if we have other things we need to do. And they were like, no, like, you're putting in a lot of time. Like, you really, like, your family needs to be compensated for some of that. And that was exciting to have somebody else advocating for me to get paid so that my family wasn't overextended.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's more of what I see in the scriptures when it's talking about the worker getting paid
Yeah.
and stuff, is like that the church goes like, no, you're putting a lot of time into our
Yeah.
spiritual care. We got to take care of you.
Yep. Yeah, and again, to be balanced, we know that, as we said, Paul talks about that and
Right.
makes a case for it. So, that's awesome.
Yeah. So it was cool because the way I'd always seen it was, you know, pastors going and asking for more money or getting the degree so they could get the higher pay grade or whatever it was. And again, not to like talk down on any degrees or any like, but I feel like it's like degrees should be so that you can learn more, so that you can offer more. Churches should be so that people can, you know, have a community in which they can grow in their faith instead of it being about getting paid. And there are other ways to get paid if that's not there.
Yeah.
What are some of your favorite examples of this that you've seen in the last few years?
You? You? Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of friends that I have that are planters are on the trajectory of I got money, I need to plant this, I need to grow it so it can sustain me, you know, rather than going in with the strategy on the front end to go like I want to be sustainable from the very beginning. Yeah. And then whatever happens with the church happens, because, you know, if 3 years into it, your church is 35, and that's awesome. But if your goal is to plant a church to cover your income, then that's not awesome. Right. And then again, you're left scrambling. And so, but I always find it interesting is because like anytime like there's a regional collective of planters, you know, associated with the denomination, it's really, unfortunately, there's a great divide. So like you have a lot of and it's divided by race. So it's assumed that the white guys get a lot more funding for planting, and it's assumed like most minorities are bivocational. Really? Yeah. Wow. And it's like, so how, you know, and so that's really, to me, that's troublesome. Yeah. And it's heart-wrenching because, so it's almost like even this, I know it's unintentional, but they're really this classified, like, you know, again, most planters are, divided this way, and a lot of, it's just assumed. I remember reading a few months ago in The Atlantic featuring this bivocational Hispanic planter in San Antonio, and kind of the whole story was he worked a full-time job, and then he was a pastor, and they talked about like how so many minority pastors or planters have to be bivocational because just the nature of the thing. And whereas like, why is it that's assumed, that's accepted, whether it's Hispanic or African American, that it's just assumed like they work a full-time job, they have their career, and then they do ministry kind of really on the side for free. Not to even to minimize that, but they don't really get that doesn't sustain them.
Right.
But we have it totally different for like whites. And to me, that's really heartbreaking.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, that I am sort of surprised initially hearing that, but then, sadly, I could see it. And then the other thing I would assume is like you got white guys going to white neighborhoods that cost more, and so then there's probably this thing where it's like, well, they need more funding just to live at the standard of living at which they're accustomed.
Yeah.
And then but then you send somebody into like an impoverished community, and the thought process might be like, well, they don't need as much to function there.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate as well.
Yeah, and that's a whole nother, I would say another thread to really even intrepid is what I'm doing, or even mentioning it in the book, is really this whole conversation of livability.
Yeah.
And so, like, I've always found that there's a direct correlation between livability and the number of church plants.
Yeah.
So the more livable, meaning desirable, cool, hip, trendy, the more livable the city, the more livable the neighborhood, the more planters there are. And conversely, the opposite is true. The more lower income, school districts with bad schools, all just what maybe is unlivable, unsightly. As a whole, they receive a lot less, if any, planters. So it's like, again, why is there that correlation between livability, coolness, and a lot of plants in the opposite, the other direction?
And I mean, it's like there's always a tension like with the planter of like wanting. I mean, this is about the gospel, but it's also like tied into it. There's something about like the lifestyle I want to live, right? So there's always that tension is there, and it's good to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And then, and then probably, just I don't know, being in the cool hip place, you're going to get some attention for that versus like if you, I mean, there was a church that I was involved with, served at in Chicago, South Chicago, that within their denomination, I mean, they're, people know about it because a lot of people go there and serve, but generally it's not a well-known thing. It's not booming. Ministry there is super hard. You've got people in and out and relapsing and all sorts of stuff. So it's, but to me, it's like, man, that is just a beautiful church. But you're never going to get noticed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you teach, you get a lot of church planters through your classroom.
Actually, my teaching has nothing to do with church planting.
Oh, well, okay. Wrong.
Well, I mean, I'm
just thinking of people I've met who ended up going toward church planting.
Yeah, I mean, I've taught a couple times church planting classes in seminaries, but right now all of my undergrad courses are a lot related to urban studies. Like intro to the city, another one like bicycles, equity, and race. And I'm at a university which I love. So actually, it's the most diverse university in Oregon. So most of our students, I think like 62% of our students are minorities.
Okay.
So which is great because, I mean, I brought, this is a side note, so I brought my class here because on the intro to the city, we do a lot of field trips.
Yeah.
So we talk about like the economics of the city. We go do a third wave coffee tour. We talk about maybe security in a city. We go visit like a homeless shelter, homeless camp. And so... Yeah, so for me, it's even I feel like I learn, so much from them because I'll bring them here. Again, most of my students are minorities, most of those Hispanics, and we'll go to a cool white trendy coffee shop.
How do they react to the cool white trendy?
Yeah, so our debriefs are always amazing.
Wow.
And again, it helps me think through like ministry and church planting along these lines about marketing, who are we targeting, what about this group, what about that group, and... Yeah,
and I would assume like when you're getting into the ministry / like vocational stuff, all that needs to be considered too. Because if you're going to be on a mission to a community, maybe the business you start needs to also have that same mentality, right?
Yeah.
Like, how can we... Actually, Sean and I, my buddy in Tucson, we sort of see this as a whole in what we do, because the products that we create can only be purchased by wealthy folks. I mean, that for us to pay our bills, we have to charge that much for like custom work that we do. But we've talked about how, you know, so many of the folks that we want to be engaging with can't afford this stuff, and how can we change that over time? So we've been discussing, you know, that getting, you know, a desire for us is to add that layer to our business, to where like neighbors to our church could actually be our customers. So that's, anyway, I assume that'd be an interesting, you know, piece to like that consideration. The other thing we've thought about is like, well, since we do fine craft, could we someday like engage in training people to do it, you know, vocationally? Like, could we offer that in the future? So it's like wanting to take the business and not just make it just an income stream, but also like to integrate it completely with our lives in the community. Like this is a way that we build in, which is kind of the Father Kino sort of thing. I'm sure ministry conversations happened out in the fields, but then training people to have a sustainable crop and herd was also just being a good neighbor.
Yeah, and there's always tension, and there's then also, like, as I was trying to say, just recognizing my own blind spots. Like, you know, I'm white. I'm well educated. You know what I mean? And Kino was a European, white European, cross-cultural missionary to, you know what I mean? So I think not, you know, for me, I'm always trying to say, all right, in saying all this, I also recognize who I am, my own vantage point. So I'm just not white guilt, but just saying, I mean, this is who I am. And in every semester, we always talk about this in my class. Like, again, one of the ones I lead, you know, it's more than just a class. We actually, the course is structured where we do community together. So we do a lot of sharing our stories, kind of our past, our background. And so usually, you know, leading up to it, like I'll do like a coffee cupping and spend time talking about like the beans and getting into the origin of the farm, you know, the elevation and all that kind of stuff. Really to make the point that, you know, in roasting, you know, so much of the work is in the beans. And so when you get it, all the flavors in there, and your job as a roaster is to accentuate all that. You know, the same with our own stories is like, none of us chose our family, our upbringing, our ethnicity. You know, like, I didn't choose that I was going to be like a 5'10" white dude. Like, I wish I was like 6'8", sick vertical. You know what I mean? Like all the, like, but the point is, none of us chose any of that. So it's not like this kind of berating ourselves because of our station in life. It's just recognizing who we are, and even the advantages that we have, and how do we then leverage any advantage we have for the furtherance of the gospel, for the betterance of people around us that don't have those same kind of advantages, simply because color of skin, the family they were born into, etc.
Yeah, there's something to the whole life experience. I remember I did not want to work in like a wealthy community at one point in my life, because I didn't get it, I didn't relate to it, and then I ended up at potentially the wealthiest church in Tucson for 6 years, and which was, for so many reasons, really good for me, and it was a haven for me in a time of need, but it was also broke down some like stereotypes that I had erected about wealthy folks. But then I've also seen like some of those relationships, like in our church context, you know, what a gift it's been that I know businessmen, and I know doctors. Like, so it's interesting that I got that experience, and I could be like, oh, I'm ashamed I worked at the wealthy church, and that was my, you know, that was my past that wasn't very, you know, urban of me or whatever. But then it's like, well, what if that was a huge gift in like God connecting wealthy folks in our city down to our little urban church later on.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's so many pieces of our story that that get to be utilized in God's plan. I'm sure you see that in your life in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
Well, I'm going to call it to a close because I suppose
Sounds
you've
good.
got a job to do.
Yeah.
You put in a 35-minute talk, which isn't bad at all.
That's what you had said it was going to be.
Yeah, right around there. So, thanks, man.
Yeah.
Thanks for talking on a mic. I kind of threw
As
that
people walk
curveball at
by
you.
and look at us.
And photograph us in one
Yeah.
case. That was different.
We'll see if we're on some social media posts.
All right, thanks.